Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. It's great to have you all with us once again. The United Nations Independent Commission on Inquiry on the protests that took place in the occupied Palestinian territory presented its findings last week. And it found there was a disproportionate and unlawful use of force against defenseless civilians in the Gaza Strip during the Great March of Return, those demonstrations. The commission focused only on the events that took place in 2018, though many of those demonstrations are still taking place in 2019. Let's hear one of the authors of the report, Sarah Hussein, as she summarizes the findings of the report in her own words.
We found that 189 Palestinians were killed, 183 of them with live ammunition, and this included children, people with disabilities, journalists, and paramedics. We also found that 6,106 people were injured by Israeli snipers shooting at protesters with live ammunition. By the end of the year, 122 of these people had suffered amputations. These included 20 children. More amputations and indeed more killings and more injuries have been continuing since 2019, as you heard. Just a few weeks ago, on the 8th of February, 3 more children were killed by Israeli soldiers using live ammunition against civilian demonstrators. A total of 35 children, according to our findings, were killed during this period. According to our verified data, 60% of them were killed with gunshots to the head. They included a 14-year-old girl who was standing 100 meters from the separation fence. As for people with disabilities, we found that one person, a double amputee, was killed, shot and killed as he sat in his wheelchair. On 2 separate days, 2 people, visibly walking on crutches, were shot in the head. They were killed. 2 journalists were also killed during the demonstrations, and at least 39 journalists were injured with live fire. In all of these cases, we found that the journalists were wearing press vests. They were clearly marked as journalists. 4 of them were shot below the abdomen, in the abdomen, just below where their press vest ended. We also found that 3 paramedics were killed. 1 of them was a woman. Another 39 paramedics were injured with live ammunition again, and as they provided medical assistance to demonstrators. We're clear there's no justification for the killing of children and persons with disabilities who pose no imminent threat to life or serious injury to those around them.
The commission found that not only were there no justification for the killing of 189 protesters while injuring over 6,000 people during the Great March of Return protests, the Israeli soldiers committed violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. Some of those violations may constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity and must be immediately investigated by the Israeli authorities, said the chair of the commission, Santiago Cantan of Argentina. The report also mentions that 4 Israeli soldiers were injured at the site of the demonstrations on top of all that. Israel and the United States now have withdrawn from the Human Rights Council, which has direct relation to this organization that found this report. And to help us sift through all these complexities is Professor Kevin Jon Heller, who's an associate professor of public international law at the University of Amsterdam, a professor of law at the Australian National University, and an academic member of the Doughty Street Chambers. His most recent book is The Nuremberg Military Tribunals and the Origins of the International Criminal Law. And Kevin Jon Heller, welcome to The Real News. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So the Israeli government claims that the soldiers deployed at the separation fence between Israel proper and Gaza, their action was taken to protect Israel from terrorists at their border. And so the question is, what kind of operation is the Israeli army or any army allowed to conduct to prevent Palestinians in this case from crossing the fence, as they said? And what procedure is expected by international law when soldiers just use live ammunition against unarmed protesters? So could you parse that out a bit for us?
Well, in the abstract, of course, Israel is allowed to use a certain amount of force to protect its borders, but that doesn't give them, an unlimited right to use force against anybody that it so chooses. And if you look at the actual findings of the Commission of Inquiry, it's quite clear that the actions of the protesters didn't come even close to the kinds of threats to Israel that would justify using really any force, much less the kind of lethal force that we saw, again and again and again during the protests.
So, would Israel have been justified, let's say, if people crossed the border and started storming through Israel, as they would put it? Would that justify what happened if people were unarmed? Where is the line drawn?
Well, it it's a very complicated legal question, but in general, a state is only allowed to use lethal force if, in fact, there is an imminent threat to life on their side. So, if, in fact, a protester was threatening the life of an Israeli soldier or an Israeli civilian, of course, in that situation, the use of lethal force would be legally permissible. But merely crossing the border, we have a solution for that. It's called arresting them and charging them with trespassing, say, or some other kind of crime and putting them in jail. It's not shooting them and it's not killing them.
So Israel, as well as the United States, withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council. And so I'm curious how this affected the work of the council. I mean, do you think that this might have changed the way the council did things, that liberated the council to take a clear stance on what being accused of Israel's war crimes? Is it undermined the legitimacy of the council? I mean, this is, again, part of the complexity here. And can Israel now just ignore the report?
Well, that's also a very complicated question. It certainly complicates the work of the Human Rights Council that the U.S. has withdrawn from it. But the U.S. has been hostile to the council for a very long time. Israel has been very hostile to the council for a very long time. I mean, Israel kind of constantly takes the position that the council is systematically biased against Israel. And the council has spent quite a bit of time investigating Israel. It's perfectly legitimate to ask whether the council should be spending its time and energies elsewhere. But nevertheless, I mean, this is certainly a legitimate area of inquiry for the council. And although they certainly didn't get a lot of cooperation from Israel, there's no real reason to believe that these three commissioners were biased against Israel, or that the Commission of Inquiry was setting out to make Israel look bad. This is an independent international inquiry that's subject to all of the same kind of procedural requirements that any Commission of Inquiry is subject to.
So what I'm really curious about, I think our viewers would be curious about, is just where this can go. I mean, and where this might take Israel and the international courts of justice that have to hear this. I mean, we have 6,000 people who were injured, 3,000 injured by fragments, 189 people were killed. There were, I think, 122 amputees, and I think a good number of them, 20-odd of those amputees, were children. And so, I mean, so what is the legal recourse that Palestinians have against this aggression? And, they signed the Rome Convention of the International Criminal Court. So, I mean, where could this really take all this? I mean, what could be the outcome of this?
Well, I mean, this is the unfortunate part of international law, that the rules are often quite clear, but the mechanisms for enforcing it tend to be underdeveloped. It's a pretty horrific read. I think there's no question, reading the report, that there are credible allegations, credible evidence that Israeli forces committed war crimes, committed crimes against humanity, just like you said in the introduction. Where they can go to have their rights vindicated is another story. The International Criminal Court is, in fact, conducting a preliminary examination into events in Gaza from about 2014 on. These latest killings and maimings, etc., are certainly within the court's jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute, but they haven't actually opened a formal investigation yet. This will probably make it more likely that they will, but we are a very long way away from the International Criminal Court getting actively involved, much less, getting an Israeli soldier in its dock facing real war crimes or crimes against humanity charges.
Yeah, so let's explore that just for a moment. I mean, so what we mean by prosecute? How does a prosecution like this take place unless there's kind of like an international push and people are forced to, are arrested, like as took place in Liberia and other places, and sent to The Hague? I mean, so what's the recourse here? How do you think this will play out?
I wouldn't be particularly optimistic that there will be any accountability outside the court of public opinion for these kinds of crimes. The ICC is not a strong institution, as you quite rightly point out. Cooperation with the court is essential, and many states are not willing to cooperate. Certainly Israel is not willing to cooperate with the International Criminal Court. Israel wasn't willing to cooperate with this Commission of Inquiry. So getting the evidence against an individual is one thing. Actually getting the individual is another. If in fact the ICC identifies particular members of the Israeli military or particular members of the political apparatus that are responsible for these kinds of crimes, they may very well bring charges against them. That may dissuade them from going on any vacations to the French Riviera. But clearly, Israel is never going to hand over an Israeli citizen to the International Criminal Court. So it is difficult to see a scenario in which anyone responsible for these terrible crimes really ever does see the inside of a courtroom.
So in some ways, just to conclude, this could become a much more political issue. I mean, arrest warrants could be made for individual soldiers and military leaders. They could possibly be made to leaders in the Israeli government. It could be taken before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But this becomes almost in some ways, given the lack of power sometimes the international courts have, become more of a kind of political push internationally than actually a legal push. Or am I wrong about that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Whatever consequences there will be for Israel really will be in the court of public opinion. It really will be, their ability to do business with the European Union, with the United States, and I don't think we should underestimate that. I mean, it's not the same as actually putting someone in the dock and prosecuting them and maybe putting them in jail for a long time. But there are costs to Israel, reputationally, economically, etc., to kind of continually engaging in these kinds of activities and to kind of continually have those activities called to account by a credible investigative mechanism like the Commission of Inquiry.
Well, Professor Kevin Jon Heller, this has been an interesting conversation. I appreciate you taking the time with us today. Go enjoy your dinner, if that's what you're about to do. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm Mark Steiner here of the Real News Network. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.